Well, welcome everyone. We're so glad you joined us for the importance of private land for wildlife, the role of land trust with Chet Work tonight. This is the third of a whole series of events that Gallatin Valley Earth Day is holding this year, and it culminates in the Gallatin Valley Earth Day Festival on Saturday, April 22nd at the Emerson Center for the Arts and Culture. That same day, we're also hosting an Earth Day Fun Run, and this year it will be benefiting the Indraland Audubon Wetland Preserve, which is just off of Main Street on the east end. So I'm so thrilled to see all of you here in person. And also I wanted to give a big shout out to all the people that are joining us online. And I just wanted to let you know that after Chet's done speaking tonight, we will have a question and answer period. So if you're here in the live audience, I will be going around with a microphone. Just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over for you to ask a question. And we will also be fielding questions from the folks joining us online tonight. Rich will be reading the questions from the people online to Chet. And if you're online, please look at your screen. There's a column on the right side of your screen. And if you go partway down, there's a section that says questions. And that's where you type in your question and press enter. And then we'll get your question over to Chet. So my name is Ann Reddy, and I am the chair of Gallatin Valley Earth Day. And we are so fortunate to have Chet Work with us tonight. He's the executive director of Gallatin Valley Land Trust. Before we get started, I was just curious, quick show of hands, how many of you joined us for our last talk, which was the grizzly bear talk at the Emerson a few weeks ago? Oh, right, okay, I see a few hands. If you didn't get a chance to see it, I just wanted to let you know that it was recorded, and if you go to the Gallatin Valley Earth Day website, you can watch that recording. It was quite a good event. So at that event, Todd Wilkinson had talked about the importance of land here in this area outside the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, and how very important it was for not only grizzly bears, but elk. For millennial times now, a lot of key elk herds have used this area for migration corridor and to live. And so Todd made the point and warned us that actually the future of the grizzly bear and other wildlife is in jeopardy because of land development. As you probably noticed, it's going crazy all around here. And a lot of areas that the wildlife need are actually not public lands. They are actually privately owned lands. And so that is why tonight's talk is so very important. And we're so glad to have Chet here talk about how we can protect those private lands for the wildlife. So I'm gonna progress this here. Before I introduce Chet, I wanted to thank Gallatin Valley Land Trust for being a partner for this event tonight. And I encourage you to go to their website at gvlt.org and check out all the amazing things that they're doing. And then lastly, tonight's free event would not have happened without the generous support of lots of businesses and nonprofits and government agencies in our community who are generously supporting this talk. I would like to thank our fiscal sponsor, Greater Gallatin United Way, for supporting us. And I'd also like to thank our premier sponsors, the City of Bozeman, Gallatin Valley Subaru, and Audi Bozeman. And then our benefactor sponsor, Sacagawea Audubon Society, and our stewards, Bridger Bowl Ski Area, Valley of the Flowers Landscaping, Happy Trash Can, Bozeman Green Build, and the Gallatin Wildlife Association. And of course, all of our community members who volunteer to make this happen. I'm very grateful to them. And I also want to give a big thanks to the Hope Lutheran Church for providing this venue for us, and our fabulous tech team tonight, Lorene Reed from the Sacagawea Audubon Society and Taylor Burlage. So just a quick little reminder here about our festival on the 22nd and our Earth Day Fun Run. And now I am ready and thrilled to introduce Chet Work. Chet has spent the last 20 years working in conservation, and a great majority of that time he actually worked within the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. Now, before coming to the Gallatin Valley Land Trust, Chet led two of the most successful land trusts in the country. One of them was the Teton Regional Land Trust in Eastern Idaho. And more recently, he led the land trust in Santa Barbara County, California. Not only has he had a lot of leadership roles in land trust, but he also in the past has worked as a land manager for the Nature Conservancy in Idaho. And then in the summer of 2020, we were really lucky that Chet, his wife, and his 3 kids moved here to Bozeman so that he could be the executive director of the Gallatin Valley Land Trust. So now I'd love to have you help me give a warm welcome to Chet. Thank you.
I'm actually going to try and wear this thing. I like to joke that that's the house we were able to afford when we moved here in 2020. Thank you, Ann. I really appreciate it. Happy to be here. Can everyone hear me okay in the back? Awesome. Really pleased to be part of this lineup. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to all the folks who came tonight and who are watching on the live stream. It's an honor to be here. A little nervous as well. When you're around Bozeman, you are amongst the conservation elite in the nation, and I look across rooms and I see mentors and people who are much longer in the tooth with regards to private lands conservation than I am. So I'll try not to overstep my bounds tonight. I'm sure there's some folks online who I look up to in this realm. But hopefully I have enough experience to entertain you a little bit tonight with stories of private lands conservation, and it's truly my passion. Again, my name is Chet Work, and I thought I'd just spend about 2 minutes telling you a little bit about the Gallatin Valley Land Trust. If you do not know, it's a real honor for me in my career to come to this land trust. It is one of the strongest in the nation, and I'm really pleased to be part of this organization. The Gallatin Valley Land Trust seeks to conserve open lands, wildlife habitat that we're talking about tonight, agricultural lands, lands with cultural significance, and we do so across Park County, Gallatin County, and Madison County. We also have a mission you see up there to preserve trails, catalyze trails, and connect our community through the creation of trails. We've done that in the community of Bozeman for the last 30 years, and I bet some of you probably know about GVLT or the Gallatin Valley Land Trust because of a trail that you've hiked on or something in your backyard. It is truly a remarkable community in which we live, and GVLT's been fortunate to have a role in that. We have a strong legacy of success over the last 30 years. We've been fortunate to work with partners to catalyze nearly 100 miles of trails in the network we call the Main Street to the Mountains Trail System. And we're grateful to the community members that come out every year and help maintain and build new trails. Maybe you see some folks that you know. That was a party last year at Drinking Horse, putting in new signage. Maybe you've seen the signs that crew was able to create. Our land conservation programs had great success as well. In 30 years, we've had the fortune to help 110, maybe 115 families to conserve about 122 properties and 52,000 acres. That's a very significant amount of land, but what I love most is that the number of landowners doesn't match the number of properties. These families have come back to work with us more than once, and there's no greater honor than I have to have a family say, you did so well helping us to conserve our land that we want to do it again. We want to do it for another parcel. We continue to try and accelerate the pace of our work. One of the messages that we've found really sad and compelling, well, that's even better for me. One of the messages that we found sort of unbelievable is that in the same 30 years that it took us to conserve 52,000 acres, more than 100,000 acres has been converted into rural and residential subdivision in Gallatin County alone. So I'm kind of a competitive person. That means the developers are moving twice as fast as the conservationists. We need to increase the pace of our work. If that's a compelling message, I hope that you'll look up GVLT.org, pull me aside at the end of this, talk to us about it. There's 1,000 people that support our work. There's 100,000 people in this community that use our trails. We need all the energy we can get to try and keep up with the development pressure that's out there. And with that, I'll actually leave the concept of GVLT. Private lands conservation is not owned by the Gallatin Valley Land Trust. We live in a landscape where there's actually many groups doing private lands conservation, and I'm going to do my best to speak on behalf of everyone and not just the Gallatin Valley Land Trust. We happen to be your local one here in Bozeman, but there's some names up here that I hope you recognize. The Nature Conservancy, the world's largest land trust. It's very active in Montana. They have offices in Bozeman and a great team working to conserve this state as well as conservation programs around the globe. The Montana Land Alliance is a statewide land conservation organization. They work all over Montana. They're probably the most successful land trust in the state. And they've done great work right here in Gallatin County as well as Madison and Park counties. The Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, we have a number of what I would call single species conservation groups. That's that RMEF. I apologize. Sometimes these organizations go with their acronyms. Ducks Unlimited is active here. Pheasants Forever is active here doing land conservation work. But RMEF, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, they will hold conservation easements. That's a term we'll talk about later in this presentation. And lastly on there, the Trust for Public Land. Many of you may know that name from their really iconic park, the Story Mill, I say that right, Story Mill Park, thank you, that they put in for our community over the years. They do great parks and trails work as well across the country, especially in urban areas. But in Montana, their biggest impact is working with timber companies to set aside large tracts of land. And I don't want to ignore the fact that all these organizations are working hard to preserve landscapes like this. GVLT has had great success, but we've done nothing without our partners. Every single project we've had has included municipalities, landowners, and organizations like these to make ourselves successful. So I hope you will support one or some of these organizations. I bet there's probably people that support them all, and we're grateful for that. None of this gets done without the support of the community. I think it speaks to the natural resources of Southwest Montana that you would have 5 private lands conservation or focused organizations working hard to reach out to landowners. And it probably speaks pretty highly of the community that supports these organizations that we can support 5 of these organizations and the efforts that they have. I want to talk about private land conservation, and lots of times people say, why is private land important? And I think one of the best ways for me to convey that is to tell you the story about how I actually figured out why private lands are important. And it starts with this image. And I want to ask someone here in the live audience to tell me what these 5 species have in common. And while you're thinking about that, I'll let you know that I gave this quiz to some local 8th graders the other day, and one of them said they're all reptiles. I don't want to speak about the education system in Bozeman. That answer, in case you were thinking it, is actually incorrect. Can anyone tell me what these 5 species all have in common? Very close, but not quite right. Another guess? Awesome. They were endangered. These 5 species, the bottom right one debatably, are recovered endangered species. And when I was in graduate school, I took a course on the Endangered Species Act. You can teach a whole class about it. It's pretty, I guess it's People have differing opinions on one of the effectiveness of the Endangered Species Act. I don't want to get into that, but one of the things I did in that class was I actually went and I looked at the endangered species list. They actually have a list. At that point, it was 2,500 species that had been put on the global endangered species list. At the bottom of that list, there's this tiny little blip, 50 species that have been recovered. Below that, there's a dismal 10 or 15 that have gone extinct. But of the 50 that have been recovered, most of them, for the most part, I think that they had a technicality to get them off the endangered species list. Somebody found an additional population. Somebody determined that the genetics were such that they could be merged with a different population. They came off because science said maybe they're not as rare as you think. But there's a handful. There's maybe a dozen, just like these sort of charismatic and iconic megafauna, as I would call them, that actually did recover. And when I look at these species, I say, wow, how is that possible? Well, these species were on that list because we were killing them. We were poisoning them, we were shooting them, we were harvesting them, we were afraid of them. And when we changed the regulatory mechanisms, the laws around these species, and people stopped harvesting them, they came roaring back in great numbers. There's a bald eagle that sits in the tree above my house almost every day in the middle of nowhere. In the 1970s, there wouldn't have been any bald eagles in the Gallatin Valley, zero. There was one in the state of Idaho at Henry's Lake at the top of that watershed, one nesting pair. Now we find them all over the place. What is it about these species that allowed them to come flying back? They are habitat generalists. So when you take away the threat that imperils them, they're no longer being killed or harvested, they can come back. They can live almost anywhere. They travel widely. They eat many kinds of food. They're not habitat specialists. But you look back at that list of 2,500 species, and there's 2,450 that are on that list because their habitat has had this happen to it. You're not going to come back from the endangered species list if 50% of the endemic habitat that you have is paved. That started me thinking, my gosh, if I care about fuzzy creatures, which I do, how am I going to make an impact on them? Habitat, habitat, habitat. Does that make sense? And then I started to think, where is the habitat? It may be a little hard to see in the back, but this is a map of the public lands across 2/3, 3/4 of the United States of America, sort of focused in on those western states, and each one of those colors represents a different federal land management agency. So the yellow is the Bureau of Land Management, the army green is the Forest Service, the bright green is the Park Service, that pinkish red represents our Native American reservations, Indigenous people reservations. Blue, I think, is Department of Energy, Defense, and brown is Department of Energy. Most people in the United States say, oh my gosh, 70% of the United States is private, 30% is in the public domain. Pretty accurate. If you were in Nevada, you would say that 80% of our land is in the public domain and 20% is in the private. Lots of people look at the Western United States and they say, why do we need to conserve habitat? It's already conserved. And they're right. There's a lot of habitat that is conserved. But when I look at this map, I start looking beyond the colors. I start looking at the gaps in the colors and I say, what is that narrow little sliver and why is it private? Here's your iconic Western Valley. There are many that look just like this. This happens to be the Paradise Valley looking south from just below Livingston. You're seeing Emigrant Peak up here, actually Emigrant Peak here. To me, this is the traditional Western Valley. And what you have up here is rock and ice and Forest Service, and then you have some timberlands, and then you have some ranch lands, and then you have a river, a highway, and then it goes in reverse. You have some ranch lands, you have some timberlands, and you have some public lands. When I showed you that map of the Western United States, there were lots of these valleys that were carved out. What's in the public domain is rock and ice. What's in the private domain? Anything that can grow a cow or a blade of grass or a blade of wheat. In 1862, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, he said, go forth and settle the West and make sure those French trappers don't try and take it back from us. And people came out with the ability to take 160 acres, and they didn't choose the top of Emigrant Peak. They chose the properties that would produce. They would produce cows, they would produce grain, they would produce crops, they would produce wealth for that family, sustenance for that family. Those are the same lands that produce deer and elk and moose. We have pushed our wildlife into these lands because where they want to be is in these lands. It's said that 5% of the land mass on the western United States is associated with water. Streams, creeks, rivers, wetlands, the scientific term mesic landscapes or riparian landscapes. 5% of the land cover has water, and 95% of the wildlife depends on that 5% of the land. If I take you back to my class, species go endangered because they lose habitat. Where's the habitat? Habitat is the private land. And why? Because it has the resources to create sustenance. It has the resources to grow food. And it does so really well for people, and it does so really well for wildlife. And it also happens to be the easiest to develop because it's level and it's beautiful. And so we have all three of those things, agriculture, development, and wildlife, all trying to pile in on the exact same acres. Why do these private lands count? Because they are the most productive and they are the most valuable. Let me back out a little bit and we'll talk a little bit about more why private lands count. In the late 60s and the early 70s, many of you probably know this because they have close ties to this community. The Craighead brothers were studying the bears in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And they found that the 600 or 700 bears at that time didn't stay in the park. Lo and behold, they left the park. And if they were going to manage the bears, they were going to have to keep them from being shot in a larger area than just the two orange national parks. The map that the Craighead brothers drew and coined the term Greater Yellowstone was roughly the blue. They said, if we can save the blue and the orange here, we will actually conserve these 700 bears and all of their travels in and out of the park. Really amazing. That blue is represented by the 5 national forests. At that time, there were 6 national forests, but 5 national forests and 2 national parks. If you can conserve that, you will save this population of grizzly bears. Great. But the bears are kind of unique because when things get rough in Yellowstone, they go to sleep. All the other animals that live in Yellowstone have to leave the park. Many of you know this. Where do they go? Guess what? They go to the brown part of this map, and guess who owns the brown part? Private lands. If we are to conserve the resources of Yellowstone National Park, we need to conserve them year-round. The very wildlife that we deem to be that of the national park actually also belongs to those private lands on the periphery. If we fail to conserve the peripheral private lands, we will lose the wildlife that we attribute to the park. When you think about the history of Yellowstone, it was drawn almost in a perfect square to encompass not the wildlife resources, but the geothermal and geologic resources. Our earliest national parks, Yosemite, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, Glacier, they're all about rocks, okay? The fact that we now consider Yellowstone to be iconic wildlife just happened because we started to develop everything on the edge and we drove those animals into the park. If we don't let them come out of the park, we lose them, but we gotta have a place for them to come out of. 2002, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition and the Nature Conservancy found a esteemed wildlife biologist and asked him, can you come into this Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and tell us which of these river valleys that comes out of the park are the most important and which ones are the most threatened? And a lot of that focus came here on the west side of the park, up towards Bozeman. These valleys have great value for the iconic wildlife of the park, and if we fail to conserve them in the face of development pressures, we will have problems. Many of you may have seen this. It's been in National Geographic. It's been all over the internet. This is a map created by Arthur Middleton, who's at UC Berkeley, and his graduate students studying the movements of individual elk and elk herds. And each one of these colors represents animal in a herd, but you can see every one of these elk touches the park at least once during the year, but look how far out they're going, all the way down into the Shoshone Reservation, Jackson Hole, Green River, Cody, Bozeman, Gallatin Valley, Paradise Valley, Centennial Valley, Henry's Lake, Teton Valley, all these places, they are the place where the wildlife retreats. And you can think of this for elk, as Arthur Middleton did. You can think of it for mule deer, pronghorn, trumpeter swans, sandhill cranes. Most of the bird species of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem travel a little bit farther south than you can see on this map. But for those species that have to walk out of the park, private lands become pretty important because they're low in elevation and high in productivity. So private lands are the most productive. They're also pretty critical for seasonal use for some species. This is a piece of private property held in a conservation easement by the Gallatin Valley Land Trust, just on the outskirts of Bozeman, Jackson Creek area. And in the summer, these fields are full of cows, and in the winter, this is what they look like. This will give you some concept of what do private lands provide. This is a wintering elk herd right here in Bozeman. This is an image I found from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks. And the last element of private lands that I want to discuss is that private lands don't need to be pristine. Sometimes they just need to be open enough to allow animals to pass through. That idea that some of the development and change that we're having on the landscape is creating these very narrow and critical bottlenecks in movement corridors for animals. This happens to be near Craig on the Missouri River. But the private landowners on either side of the river right there have a pretty significant role to make sure that this mule deer herd can get back and forth every year. And think about the private lands that may not have forage, may not have shelter, may not have cover to keep wildlife year round, but they may be the only open conduit. That idea of a movement corridor. We see a lot of that conversation here on Highway 191, Highway 89 in the Paradise Valley, and certainly up on Bozeman Pass. We were just talking before this meeting about the unfortunate sign of a migration corridor is roadkill. That's where you can tell where animals are trying to cross. Private lands are also the most threatened. I thought this was a pretty good image. It's about a block from where we're standing. That's Blackwood Road and 19th out there, the intersection. It's very difficult to convert public lands to residential subdivisions. It happens, it does happen, but very rarely. It takes large public decisions to make a choice to convert those lands. However, a private land is quite easy to convert because you just merely need to convince a landowner, one person, and all of a sudden it changes. And that makes it very difficult to control the conversion of these lands if it's all in the hands of one person's opinion. Makes sense? So to review, I would say they're the most productive, they're the most valuable. They have seasonal year-round issues or winter range, spring range, calving range. They have migration corridor values, and they're also really highly threatened and difficult to control. Sorry. I know this talk is supposed to be about wildlife habitat, but I don't want to, I'll bring this back up at the end. There's other values to land that are not wildlife. And I feel like oftentimes the wildlife interests don't want to recognize agricultural values, don't want to recognize ecosystem services, which I'll talk about later. But I had the fortune to work in this valley in California. These fields produce 7 to 8 crops a year in rotation. This is literally the fruit basket of America. The crops that come off of this land are tremendous, and yet look at the crop we're growing in the bottom. We continue to take topsoils that are 30, 40, 50 feet deep and turn them into housing. We're making bad choices about open lands across the globe, certainly across our country, and wildlife is a big concern, but we should also start thinking about how are we going to produce food and sustenance for ourselves. So here's where it gets a little funny. What do we do? How do we conserve private lands? I've been working on this theory for a while, and it's probably amusing to people, but I see two sort of dichotomous ways to conserve land. One is regulatory, and one is incentive-based. By regulatory, I mean government choices, municipalities, city, county, state, federal zoning. You might think of these as setbacks from a creek. You might think of them as housing densities. If we're going to conserve wildlife habitat, those regulatory mechanisms could be really significant. We were talking before the presentation about how European countries are focusing their growth not on the agricultural lands, that they preclude their communities from developing agricultural lands. You must build elsewhere. It's too critical for that. They're using a regulatory mechanism. They're using a communal decision to set aside certain lands for certain uses. That regulatory-based conservation is highly effective. If you were to take a stream and you wanted to conserve the corridor that runs along it, and you had 150, 200, 300 foot setbacks, you would actually conserve a really viable wildlife corridor down that creek. If you make your setback 10 feet or no feet, you have not done much. You can do a lot of conservation in a regulatory mechanism, but it's pretty unpalatable for the people who own that land. And how can you tell me what I can and can't do with my property? What I've recognized in my career is that regardless of the strength of the regulatory mechanisms in any community, there seems to be what I would consider an extra interest in the community to do more. Maybe it's not 50% of the community that wants to do more, but it's a concerned few citizens, and I'm guessing there's quite a few here tonight, that will put their time and their energy and perhaps their money where their mouth is, and they will help to fuel what I consider to be the incentive-based conservation. And I've drawn them here as a sphere and an atmosphere because it makes sense in my eye. In every community I've lived in, there has been that interest from the community to do more than they were willing to do with laws and rules and regulations. They wanted to see more conservation. And to be quite honest with you, that's the realm of land trusts and private land conservation. I always think about this. In California, there's more rules than you can shake a stick at. That regulatory sphere is big, but there's still a little bit more that those communities want, and land trusts are thriving, working in incentive-based conservation with individual landowners. Montana probably could be described as having a smaller regulatory sphere and a larger incentive-based atmosphere, if that makes sense. So the tool that land trusts use, all 5 of those that I mentioned before, is a tool called conservation easements. And that is probably the worst name that was ever invented. We all wish we could rename them. But let me describe it a little bit on a spectrum. Conservation, I see, has a number of ways that you can proceed. The easiest and the cheapest is education. I could hire one of these younger people back here, and maybe I could send them out each day to a landowner, and I could say, can you go to these landowners and preach wildlife conservation and sustainable agriculture and keeping your plow and your cows out of the creek? And can you teach these landowners how to think about the world around them without impacting their productivity too much? Education, maybe these guys are really productive. They look like they could get about 365 landowners a year convinced. That's a great way to pursue conservation. However, when that landowner sells or when that landowner passes away, you may be back to square one. So education is cheap but impermanent. The other end of the spectrum, we could just go out and buy all the land. We could raise money in our community and we could go out and we could own the land, and then we could make whatever choices we wanted about how that land is managed. We could not let the cows in the creek. We could put up the right kind of fences that let the pronghorn duck underneath. We could manage for wildlife in the best possible way. But as you might have guessed, that end of the spectrum is quite expensive, especially in this community. So on one side, you have something that's inexpensive and impermanent, and on the other end of the spectrum, you've got something that's really permanent. As long as your organization is around, you can own that piece of property, but it's really expensive. A conservation easement is the middle ground. It's more permanent than education. It's a legal restriction that runs with the property, but you don't actually have to own the property. You work with the landowners to find a balance that works for them, and you hold a contract over what they can and can't do with the property. They're voluntary, they're perpetual, and they legally protect the natural resources or the conservation values that are on the property. Pretty interesting way of doing things. What I love is that they keep those family lands in family hands. And I can think of no better steward of some of our private lands than the very family that's been doing it for 5 generations. But in this community, you can understand how hard it is for a family that's had property for 5 generations to hold on to it. With all the real estate movements, with the incredible revenues they could get from selling right now, pretty hard decisions that they're making. Conservation easements can help with that. They keep land in production. There are those that say we shouldn't be farming in some of these landscapes. Years ago, there was a phrase, cows, not condos. We'd rather have agriculture than to have subdivision and development in some of these landscapes. Conservation easements can help landowners with estate planning. GVLT is doing a great job of compensating landowners for what they're giving up, so we can actually pay them for the restrictions they're putting on their property. There's tax benefits for folks who can use those. Lots of landowners are concerned that the conservation easements are government overreach. I assure you they're not eminent domain. We're not taking anything from people. We're not demanding wilderness. They can still use their property. We don't force public access upon them. We don't cut the taxes on the property. This is not zoning. What it is a conversation between a landowner and a land trust that secures the future of a piece of property forever. I often tell folks that my staff go out, and many of the landowners that we are working with are hearing from developers all the time. And some of those developers are professing riches and wealth and golf courses and brand new communities. And in some ways, our conversation with these landowners is, what would it take for you not to accept that offer? How much does your family need not to turn this iconic piece of property into another resort, another development, another golf course? We're trying to find enough, in most cases, cash or money incentives to convince them not to subdivide or sell to a developer. Incentive-based conservation rather than regulatory. It's got to be voluntary. They know all the time, which is really frustrating, but we keep at it. We in some ways offer each of these landowners a third option. Every one of these landowners can keep farming or they can sell out. What we offer them is something unique. Stay on the land, but still receive some of the equity that you have in your property. Compensate them for what they're doing. We don't want to conserve everything. At GVLT and at most of those other conservation organizations I mentioned, we're pretty selective. We're running pretty high level science to try and understand where are those wildlife and vegetation values, where are the best agricultural soils and watershed resources, where can we have public access sustainably, where are those areas of community or cultural importance that we need to preserve for future generations. Also, where is the threat of development? I often tell people the first faux pas in private land conservation is to spend $5 million on a piece of property that wasn't valuable. Don't waste their money. The second faux pas is to spend $5 million on a piece of property that wasn't threatened. There's so many places that we need to conserve right now. Spending our resources in a place that's not under threat of conversion would be just as detrimental to the future for our. So we need to be very strategic about where we work. The Land Trust has created an amazing mapping system for us to understand where are those most important places. I was talking before the presentation, proximity to protected land is a pretty critical piece as well. We like to cluster our conservation so that those properties benefit from each other in a habitat perspective. I'm gonna wait for the photo here. There we go. Here's the blessing. Here's the good news. Here's a map of the Gallatin Valley. And what I've done is I've taken all the land conservation organizations that are working collaboratively and I've turned their successes orange. Many people think that no land has been protected. But what you're seeing when you drive down the road and you see open space very much likely could be one of these orange parcels. And this is the work of the Nature Conservancy, the Montana Land Reliance, and the Gallatin Valley Land Trust together, all as one color. And you can see some really significant portions of our valley have been preserved in perpetuity. This is good news for you. We recognize that there is a lot more to be done. And for our organization, we're prioritizing this Gallatin front, specifically Winter Range here in what we call Gooch Hill. We're prioritizing movement corridors in Bozeman Pass, trying to get wildlife from the Gallatin Range into the Bridger Range and into the Bangtails. We're talking about the river corridors along the East Gallatin and the main Gallatin. We're talking about the productive agricultural lands in Amsterdam and Churchill. We're talking about the remarkable wetlands that we have up at the confluence in Three Forks. That's where we can use our limited tool. We don't have the ability or the money to put a conservation easement everywhere. This is not a broad brush tool. This is a tool that these organizations can strategically deploy in the right places to get this conservation done. Again, broad brush conservation would be regulatory mechanisms, but incentive-based mechanisms are much more palatable to the local community than coming and saying, thou shalt not develop your land. I mentioned that I wanted to come back to this concept of why are private lands important beyond habitat, and the concept of ecosystem services. Obviously, we know that our private lands are providing food and fresh water, fiber for our communities. But we're starting to see more and more focus on carbon sequestration, water purification, flood control. If you noticed last year, there was a big flood in the valley next door. There's also a lot of aesthetic and cultural services. We see this a lot with the trails at GVLT. We see people telling us that just getting outside is really healing. Just driving past open space is cathartic for them. I want not only to think about this landscape from the altruistic view that it's important for wildlife, but I think we gain a lot more when we think about conservation for these reasons. And I would say that GVLT is on the cusp of starting to talk about carbon sequestration funding for conservation. There's other organizations that are using incentive-based conservation around habitat. They're paying ranchers for harboring elk in the winter. There's some interesting dynamics around incentives that are coming from these ecosystem services that I think is the frontier of private lands conservation, and will reward those folks that own the land, hopefully keep them in place as long as possible. So I have two quotes for you, and they inspire me every day. And one is by the gentleman, John Sawhill, who was the first chairman of the Nature Conservancy. And he cited the fact that we judge everybody by what we create, but perhaps we should also judge people by what we refuse to destroy. There's things that are too sacred for us to convert. And the second one, I think, is always interesting to me. Aldo Leopold's one of my heroes, but in 1934, he recognized very clearly the importance of the private landowner because he saw the value of that habitat. It's amazing how it's taken many of us nearly 100 years to come around to that same concept. And then I'll remind you who we're doing this for. I think we have a lot of generations left to come in this community that need access to the outdoors and the same opportunities to see wildlife on the ground as we have had. So with that, I'm happy to take as many questions as you have.
Rich, do we have some questions from the online folks that you want to feed to Chet? If not, okay. We will go to our audience here.
That was a great presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned when you're discussing the regulatory approach to conservation, a European model where as a community, as a country, I suppose, they are making decisions as to what can be developed and what can't. And I'm wondering if you know anything about how that is received by the people who are restricted or limited, and if they are compensating them in any way.
The short answer is no, I don't have any idea. I think that what we have seen in the United States in our history is a different version of private property than you have seen elsewhere. It's interesting, the land trust model actually came out of feudal England. So the organization that I happen to be associated with, these land trusts, there's about 1,500 of them in the United States. They're active in every state and many communities. But it came out of the idea that in England, the barons of the land didn't want to pay taxes if they allowed the people to access the land for hunting and fishing. And it's always been an interesting tax strategy. The English model doesn't have the same conservation access. Those other countries in Europe, especially Italy, Switzerland, Austria, those sort of high alpine places where arable land is really hard to find, I think they have a different view of what private land is and what communal land is. So I think that's where it comes from, but I don't know about compensation for folks avoiding developing their land.
Okay. Just 1 minute here.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated that. I do a lot of work around global biodiversity loss, and I'm very familiar with the trends that are happening globally, and we're in a biodiversity crisis. There are a million species threatened with extinction. So I really have two questions for you. One is, these efforts are great. They are so small compared to what is needed to really secure life on the planet as we know it. And so I'm curious what you have to say about how do we scale up some of these good practices. That's one thing, because this is insufficient for my children to have a life that will not be more horrible than it's already going to be. But and this is great, but it's still not enough. So that's one question, is how do we scale it up? And the second is, when it comes to private land, and goes back to my children, we need the private land for the ecosystem services that you mentioned. And that is a public good, the ecosystem services that my children will depend upon in the future. And so I'm very curious about the morality of land being held, even in a private trust, when a small d democracy should have control over those lands to decide what the future is. Like whether or not my children have enough food to eat in the future should be a decision that they make, not the decision that a handful of rich people who own all the land make. So it's a morality question about private land that we need to, for a survivable planet, and how to scale up. Thank you.
Great, thanks for that question. He didn't make me feel better about my kids right now. So let me take the scaling as the first part of that question, if you don't mind. And I would just say, I'd lean back on the fact that there's 1,500 of these land trusts that are working within their communities with the embrace of their communities to do this. And 2 years ago, the land trust community in the United States surpassed 60 million acres of land conserved. That is more private land conserved by land trusts in the United States than the entire national park system so far. Is that sufficient? No, is the answer. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, the current administration has allocated tremendous resources to try and scale up. Montana doesn't like to talk about it so much. It seems like a government overreach, but the concept of 30 by 30 is pretty inspiring to those of us who are in the realm of this. And I don't need to have it tagged to any administration. Having funding to accelerate the pace of our work and reward the stewards of these lands and get these lands secured, we think will help. And so as one organization, and again, I don't speak for the Nature Conservancy or the Montana Land Reliance, but I can tell you for the Gallatin Valley Land Trust, we're trying to more than triple the pace at which we're working, because one, we see the same change in this valley and the adjacent valleys that you do, and two, we know our time is limited. And right now we do have some federal funding resources. So I think there are attempts to scale up. We'll have to see. What I would say is that many communities combine regulatory mechanisms with incentive-based mechanisms. And for the good of our organization, we don't do the regulatory side. We don't try and tell them you can't do this, you can't do that. Todd and I, Todd's in the room, have had many conversations about why this community doesn't have an entity that's pushing for more regulatory based solutions for zoning or for habitat protection or resource protection. It's a conversation that our community needs to have, and I think there are other communities that have been able to have that conversation. I get the fact that private property rights are something that this country was founded upon. And in fact, the West was settled because we were offering private property rights for free. And I think that that's probably something larger than what the Land Trust is going to be able to take on. We're trying to work within the confines to do as much as we can, as quick as we can. But I think you're right that there may need to be a conversation at some point about who's controlling the resources that we all depend on. What I've seen in California, what I've seen starting to happen is a reflection that landowners are providing more to the community than they're being compensated for. And there's an organization associated with the Cattlemen's Association in California that suggested that the ranches in California are something on the order of $300 or $400 billion worth of water quality, air quality, carbon sequestration that they're doing on behalf of the community. Those landowners get zero of that. Their land is valued at how many houses can be put on it or how many cows can be grown on it, not all those other ecosystem services. I think if we start to value those properties for that, we'll see them converted much less. Sorry if that didn't fully answer your question. I'll avoid the doom and gloom.
Okay, there's a question from over here. So the Land Trust have been doing this for a while. There must be some parcels that have sold that have easements on them. I'm curious about the experience of the Land Trusts when those sales happen. First, do the parcels actually sell at a discount because the easement is there? And second, what experiences do you have in terms of new owners and their kind of acceptance of the easement restrictions?
It's a really good question. I think someone seeded the online region there. In a typical year, our land trust sees about 15%, so maybe 20 of our easements will get some extra scrutiny. We go out and we look at every one of these properties every year, eyes on the ground, talk to the landowners. Mostly we're trying to help them with weeds and management issues on their land, but we are making sure that they're abiding by the contract and that they're not building condominiums and they're not putting resorts on their property. Usually in a given year, we have 15 or 20% of those that we have to go talk to a realtor. Maybe they want to build a new barn and they have to come talk to us about that. The last 2 years, we've seen almost 40 to 50% of our properties having additional requests from our stewardship team. Most of that's because the real estate prices have driven longtime landowners to sell, and we're now dealing with someone else. And maybe the farmer who did the easement had a 1,200 square foot house, but the easement allowed for a larger house, and the new owner's coming in and trying to build that larger house. We're seeing a tremendous amount of pressure on that. It's part of our long-term commitment to that original grantor of the easement and to the community that we will go out and have these conversations, but we're seeing a lot more of it. And I think it's directly tied to the real estate market and those conversions. Are we having difficulties with it? No. Each land trust, ours included, holds an endowment for the monitoring of these parcels. And in the case of ours, we have a stewardship fund that allows us to utilize the corpus of that to litigate if someone were to try and violate the terms of the contract. And that seems to be so far a pretty good deterrent from someone trying to build in the wrong place or build something too big. We haven't struggled so much with that, but we're spending an awful lot of time trying to get to know the new landowners. Most of you have probably bought a property sometime in your life. You realize that there's a big part of that that's looking at the title for the property. A conservation easement is typically a 40-page document. It represents a pretty good speed bump when you're looking at your title report. So far, so good. People are seeing a 40-page document and saying, what does that thing mean? It's typically the first document at the top of the title, and it says this property's been restricted. There are land trusts across the country that have had surprised landowners who didn't know there was an easement, and they've had violations. Collectively, we have a land trust insurance policy that will help us litigate against violations, and GVLT, and I think most of the land trusts in Montana subscribe to that, and it's been really successful. For a real estate contract, which is essentially what a conservation easement is, it's been remarkably durable in the courts and has been upheld in every state, and we're fortunate that this tool has lasted and been as strong as it is. Please.
Thank you. Along the same lines, could you get a little bit more detailed about the term preserving equity, which you used in your presentation as presented to the landowner? We help them preserve their equity? Yeah.
I may not have said it just like that, but if your family's owned 1,000 acres in Bridger Canyon for 50 years, I'm sure that it was bought for 10 grand and now it's worth 10 million. And that's equity, that growth, that value of the land. For most landowners, their options are to own a $10 million property and run cattle on it, which may be really fulfilling for them. It might not be so for their kids. So they may be wondering what's going to happen when they leave it. And their other option is to sell it and have $10 million in cash in their pocket. The conservation easement, if we purchase the easement, allows them to receive some of that equity, some of that $10 million in cash, while still owning the land. So for some people, this is a diversification strategy. All my wealth is tied up in one piece of real estate. This is a great way for me to put my grandkids through college, pay down debt on my tractor, grow my agricultural operation, retire, and have money in the pocket without forsaking the family legacy that's been here for generations. And I like to say that when we're talking to landowners, and approaching them about pursuing conservation, I hope that they have their kids and sometimes their grandkids in the room, because the decision they make should they do a conservation easement will affect all those generations, both financially and physically with the property. But I often say that there's also their parents and their grandparents in the room, those older generations, because many of these landowners can't bear the idea of selling to a development when grandpa's buried under the cherry tree.
I got a question, Chet. It was kind of related to one of the previous questions, but could county or state governments provide incentives or kind of be a partner in this as far as encouraging landowners to use conservation easements?
It's a great question, Clint. Thanks for asking it. And yes, and congratulations, your county does. One of 3 counties in the state of Montana that has an open space and conservation bond is how it started. Excuse my sniffles. 16 years ago, the voters in this community passed a $10 million bond, which was used to acquire parks and open space on behalf of our community. 5 years later, you guys passed another $10 million bond to achieve this. And I believe about 9 years ago, you all passed a tax levy to do the same. And the Gallatin County Open Space bond and levy provides conservation organizations about $1.8 million a year, largely used by the Gallatin Valley Land Trust and the Montana Land Reliance to help reward landowners. $1.8 million doesn't go a long way. And we try and be as frugal with it as we can. We try and leverage it against federal funding sources and other private funding sources to reward landowners the best we can. At the same time, that funding is remarkable in the eyes of every other community. There's not one in Park County. There's not one in Madison County. Ravalli County just has one, and Lewis and Clark County has one. but those are the 3 counties in the state that actually dedicate funds towards conservation of agriculture and open space.
Great, thanks.
It could be better. North Carolina, Colorado dedicate state lottery funds to conservation. There are other states that do it different ways, and they can achieve a lot more conservation. Sorry.
Sorry, we have another online question here. Rich?
Yes, Brent asks, how do Western states track conservation lands for mapping? Is there a one-stop GIS data layer that includes conservation lands and conservation easements?
State of Montana tracks it. You can get it from the state. There's an organization known as the Montana Association of Land Trusts that I think would also aggregate and pass that along to interested parties. It's not a secret. You can see them on the cadastral layer that everyone has access to. And I was about to say, I think they may be on Onyx, but I do not believe that easements show up on some of the private new sort of geospatial recreation stuff. I don't see it on Onyx, but the state cadastral, the state Department of Conservation has it, and the Montana Association of Land Trusts all have it. There is a national conservation database. It's usually about 5 years behind by the time they get all those land trusts to report what they've done. But the state one, we update every year.
Oh, sorry, just consulting here. More question here. I think we have 4 more questions lined up, and then we'll call it quits for tonight. But I just want people to know that if you have more questions, we will send them to Chet, and he can answer them via email for you. Okay.
Thank you. In the map where you had all the different easements, I noticed that there were some parcels that were checkboard. And for parcels such as those, are those of importance? And if they are, how do you come about to obtaining easements for them?
I missed one word there. You noticed that there were parcels that were?
They're checkboard. They're in like
checkerboard.
Like,
sorry.
Yeah, checkerboard.
Thank you.
Sorry about
sort of like this, where there's holes in the middle. Is that correct? Or were you thinking about the blue ones? So another wonderful part of the Homestead Act and the way that we settled the West was that 2 sections, a section is 1 mile by 1 mile square. There's one right there. 2 sections out of every township. A township is 6 miles by 6 miles square. 2 sections out of that, 36, would be left in the state of Montana to benefit the schools. And oftentimes those lands, we call them school trust lands, were farmed, ranched, logged, mined for the benefit of the public schools. It was a revenue generation. So when you see these little squares that are evenly spaced out here, they're a nice line right there. There's a nice line right there. Those school trust sections are still on their probably original location that they were. In some cases, you'll see a cluster of them. My assumption is these ones down at Mount Ellis were an aggregation of the ones that were probably in here around Bozeman, and they just traded and put them in a cluster together. So that creates some of the checkerboard, but what you're seeing here in the middle of this big Nature Conservancy conservation easement that was done with Ted Turner, this is the Flying D Ranch that many of you probably have driven into or seen. These checkerboards are sometimes owned by other individuals, and yes, they are huge priorities. At the bottom of my list, when I said what are our priorities, I will look at a 2-acre conservation easement if it's in the center of great protected land. So the size of these at 640 acres, these would be really valuable on their own, but the fact that they're an in-holding is what we would call them when they're surrounded, really incredibly valuable. You'll see some little in-holdings here in the Forest Service. Those are really important for us. If conservation lands can be clustered together to create something bigger, they become huge priorities, even if they're in a dilapidated condition. So people often say, why would you pick up that piece of property? It's been overgrazed or it's been harmed over the years. Because it's in connectivity, because it's along a corridor with other protected lands, we can fix properties that may not be in perfect condition. That location is the key. Does that make sense? Thanks for your question.
All right. I had a question kind of just about, right now, I think that it's important that we're able to incentivize landowners to have these easements. But I think that kind of beyond that, like the biggest threat to open spaces, wildlife is a cultural phenomenon. I think that as people lose touch with these open spaces, there is a lack of awareness of the importance of those spaces, not only for us as people, we're animals too. I think they're important for us, but also for animals. And so I'm wondering, what are some routes that you guys take to educate like those grandchildren that you talked about, or kind of changing the culture to the point where folks don't necessarily need to be incentivized. They just recognize the intrinsic value of these spaces. Because ultimately, I think that there needs to be a cultural shift as well for us to also kind of address the idea of scale.
Agreed. And to persist longer than ourselves, right? This project's going to take longer than I'm alive. Who's going to take over after? Very astute question. And I'll go back to Aldo Leopold. There were wilderness advocates when Aldo Leopold that were let it be, don't touch it. And Aldo was very much a wise use, was the term. We need to be in touch with it. And if you've read some of his works, it was through hunting and fishing and use of the land that he became to love it. And I like to joke that I squeezed a lot of frogs and newts before I became a conservationist, right? Like it was that physical contact. It was holding a bird in my hand to learn its song that created the conservationist. So I believe in exposure. I heard a talk a year ago. Someone mentioned they heard Andrew Hansen talk just last night at the Museum of the Rockies. And someone said, Andy is a landscape ecologist at MSU, really amazingly bright mind. Why don't we tell the Gallatin Valley Land Trust to stop working in the Gallatin Valley and go work in the Paradise Valley where intact migration corridors still are? And his answer, I think, fits really well with your question. He said, that's like just saying we should protect Anwar where no one's ever going to be. He said conservation has to start at Cooper Park with a robin. It has to start on Pete's Hill with a random coyote that runs through once. It has to go to a place like Story Mill where you might actually find a moose and there's a flowing creek, right? And there's real nature, but it's close. If we can't have it close at hand, we'll never explore further afield. So we can talk about conserving the most valuable wilderness. And yes, it has the most value for wildlife. But if we don't create a culture where people get exposure to it, they won't care about it. So for GVLT, I think this picture is pretty critical. Our trails program is about moving people from neighborhood to neighborhood and from neighborhood to school, but it's also about getting people from Main Street to the mountains. How do we make that accessible to everyone in our community? That's where trails and conservation comes, not trails or conservation. Does that make sense? How do we find places for our community to embrace this opportunity? And we do it through access. There's plenty of other organizations here in town, Montana Outdoor Science School, Wilderness Youth Projects, all sorts of exposure to getting kids out. We don't run an education program so much at GVLT. We don't have our own youth program, but there's lots of them out there.
Okay, we have two more questions. One will be from online and then a gentleman here in the audience. So.
Yes, thanks. Via asks, I live in Jefferson County. We still have a lot of open space, especially valley lands and agriculture, but changes in development patterns are starting to impact us. What is the first step a concerned citizen can take to encourage landowners in this county to preserve open space for wildlife?
That's a really tough question. Both the Nature Conservancy and the Montana Land Reliance are working very hard in Jefferson County. GVLT is actually working on one project over there, even though it's outside of our realm. So there's reach from land trusts. So my first advice would be don't try and create a land trust. They're really hard to build, and if you've got ones that will work with you, do that. I think it's a good question though, how do you build this? The story that you hear from from other land trusts, it's funny how they all seem to be the same. They all talk about a group of citizens getting together around a kitchen table. It's never a dining room table. It's never like a coffee shop. It's around, and I envision the Formica table for some reason in my head. It's a group of concerned citizens that get around a table and they say, we are unhappy with the way things are changing in our community, and we don't want to have more regulation. And that's how a land trust starts. It's like, is there another way beyond telling our peers, telling our colleagues, telling Weird Uncle Larry that he should not be able to develop his land? Is there a way to get there? And that's what's so compelling about incentive-based conservation, is because it's not telling someone what to do, it's asking them, is there another option that you would consider? And I feel like that's the question you need to start asking. When I think about the role of a big organization like the Nature Conservancy and a smaller organization like the Gallatin Valley Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy has unlimited resources and the ability to move the federal government in ways that you can't believe, but they can't work in the neighborhood because they look like the government. And so a local land trust with great feel that's comprised of board members and staff members who are of and in the community has a lot of power. Why don't we go talk to those guys who live down the road, who do that conservation thing, and see if there's some way we can get that to work? So I would suggest that they reach out to one of the land trusts. We would be happy to connect them. If they want to use my emails here at the bottom of the slide, we'd be happy to connect them with someone who can go help them have that conversation. We sit down with neighbors, we sit down with community groups. We have them say, hey, we really don't want to see this. Is there something you can offer this landowner across the street? And we'll go make that call. It's hard to come in and try and turn someone around once they've decided to develop their land, but it happens. And it's best coming from neighbors and community than coming from some interloper, if that makes more sense. So having it be of the community, I think, is the best way for them to go.
I have a quick question and then a suggestion. If you can go back to the slide with the checkerboards, as this lady pointed out, I'm curious. My question is, do the inholdings always? What's the access situation to some of those inholdings? I mean, does that has to affect the value of the land, whether there's actual access to it or not? That's my first question. But I think to maybe bring a few of these comments together, because I have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. It's a matter of who assumes the costs of development and preservation, right? It's a financial issue. So rather than thinking about sweetening the deal with quote unquote incentives, if you think about it from the perspective of an investment, so the community, the public, the country, et cetera, is making an investment once it realizes how important these lands are to preserve them. And like any good investment, there should be a return on that investment. So I'd like to encourage you, or maybe suggest anyway, to think about it that way, because that brings, property rights and cost and all those kinds of things together. But I was curious about the access to these inholdings.
Sure. I can't speak to any of them in particular. There is public access. I mean, my eyes are drawn towards the biggest conservation easement on the map. There's public access that goes right through that ranch. In fact, it's some of the best wildlife viewing in the entire county is to drive that road. That road goes through that property because it terminates, there we go, at the Forest Service. And so that's why that access is there. It's not because there happens to be a random hole in the center. There's a lot of conversations about, here's an interesting one. Right in the center of this conservation easement is a state section. I would assume there's no public access to that state section. I don't know particularly about that property, but there's often a difficult time getting to these state sections that are completely surrounded by one or two ranches if you don't have access across those ranches. That's a big issue across the entire West. Look it up. People are ranting and raving about it everywhere. How do we get to our public lands? In some cases, that piece of public land might be a pretty good wildlife resource because we can't get to it. There's a trade-off there. I'm just trying to voice both sides. I appreciate your perspective on the return on investment. I use that phrase a lot. I use it with the people that I'm asking to support my organization. I use the incentives with the landowners I'm trying to convince. I have two audiences. And what I hope that people understand is that when they give their money to us, they're not going to get a return like if they invested in Tesla, but they might get some cleaner air, some cleaner water, and a better future for their community. And if that's equally valuable as a return from Tesla stock, then that's a pretty good investment. And it's true. What we're out here doing is trying to be the most efficient and effective way. Are there other ways to do this work? Of course, there may be other dramatic ways. I spent a lot of time in the town of Driggs, Idaho. I think some of you have probably been there. I ran the land trust there for 6 or 7 years, and I tell this story a lot. In 2008, the presidential election swung the county commission in that town. And basically overnight, it wasn't overnight, it was within 6 weeks, that county commission increased the river setbacks on every stream in that county 3 or 4-fold. And I was like, oh my God, I'm out of a job. What have I been doing my whole career? What a waste. Because in the flick of a pen, that regulatory mechanism came in and did more conservation than I ever could have. No. In 2012, that commission switched and that regulation was eviscerated instantly. It's coming back, and I'm grateful for that community. But for 4 years there, I thought my job was useless. And then I realized, no, that private land conservation, those contracts that we hold are stronger than some of these regulatory mechanisms that blow with the wind. So yeah, that's why I tell that story. Sometimes I feel like, gosh, we're just picking away at this so slowly. I wish we could do it faster. That's what I'm trying to tell the donors who can support our work and help me to hire one more person and do one more deal and get out and talk to one more landowner. We used to do 2 deals a year. We're going to try and do 9 this year. This is an organization that's growing. But at the same time, there are other ways that this can be done, and you need to have that community rally around all forms if this is something we really care about. Maybe that's a good end.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting and so informative. And if people still have questions, you're free to email us at Gallatin Valley Earth Day or GVLT. Chet gave you his email. So thank you so much again, and I thank you for coming. A recording of this event will be available on our website sometime next week. If you registered for this event, we will be automatically sending the link to the recording to you. I just wanted to tell you that if you'd like to learn more about wildlife issues, we have a really interesting talk that ties in very closely with this one tonight. Next Thursday, same place, same time. It's Wildlife Crossings, Exploring Solutions to Prevent Wildlife Vehicle Collisions. It's a short film and panel discussion with Rob Ament from the Western Transportation Institute and Liz Fairbank from the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. We also have other upcoming talks, and I encourage you to look at the poster out here or go on our website to find out more about those. So thank you so much. Good night and take care. And we hope to see you back here again next Thursday. Thanks.